day. Maybe the sky is electric blue with puffs of clouds so white they dazzle your eyes. Or maybe there is a dark line along the horizon and the anticipation of some thunder and lightning. My Aunt Billie and I have been laying in the sun. We're both sun worshippers, she tells me. But we're taking a break now to sit on the back porch in rocking chairs, her with her golden brown sweet tea, and me with my red cream soda. The smell of our copper tone is in the air, and beads of sweat ran down our glasses. Aunt Billie is sipping and smacking hers a bit to make sure the tea is just right to her taste, and is fanning herself with her paper fan, or the fly swatter, if that's what's handy. Down by the lake, the ducks are softly quacking, and most likely they'll waddle their way up for some of the bread Aunt Billie keeps for them, just like she keeps some treats for any dogs that might amble by. She loves to feed every living creature, particularly dogs and men. I remember one Thanksgiving when my friend Bobby ate so much of her creamed corn that he had to lay on the sofa, unzip his jeans, and just moan for a while. I think that was one of her happiest moments. But right now, I'm leaning back ready for the best storytelling I've ever heard. I know I'll nod off a little and feel all warm and melty inside, listening to her beautiful, soft southern voice. Before the storytelling starts, I want to tell you about my Aunt Billie because she was vivid as any of her stories. Actually, she is the story. Why am I telling you about her? Because she was one of the most embodied, present, in the moment, savoring of life people I've ever known. Not in some way that had to do with meditation or psychology or philosophy. She just relished life. I think I learned from her what it was like to let yourself sink into something fully and have pleasure. I learned from her that joy and true pleasure are as important as anything else in life. Why am I telling you about her? I guess I want to almost create a hologram, one that you can experience, that will let you feel what it is like to be so present, to savor life so thoroughly. My earliest memories of Aunt Billie were when I was very young and we visited her at her home in Georgia after a long, long drive from Indiana. She lived at the top of a steep, winding drive, and when you exited the car in the humid, late Georgia night, the pine-drenched air felt so good, like swimming in our lake back home. You knew you had entered another world somehow. When she came out the door, things became brighter. It was like her color was more colorful. Things became more alive when she entered the picture. In my mind, I see her always in shorts. When she worked, it was in shorts and a tube top with a kerchief tucked in the front to take out and wipe her brow with when she was sweating. She loved to work, to garden, to sweep, to build, to cook. She had strong, good legs, and they were always tan. Her hair was almost black, shortish, and curly. Her eyes, mostly rich green, but if you looked closely, they had hints of aqua. From morning till bedtime, she wore red lipstick and mascara, and a little line of vivid blue along her lids. She also wore earbobs, as she called them, all the time. even to garden, ones that dangled a bit, and a couple bracelets that would make nice clicking noises as she moved. She wore strappy sandals that showed her brightly painted toenails and that had thin, flat soles which would make delightful tapping noises as she moved along the steps or drive, sweeping. Sweeping, sweeping. I can still hear the lulling sound of her broom as she swept the millions of copper-colored pine needles from her steps and drive. Whoosh, whish, whoosh, whish, like a little sea. I would nod off listening to it if I was sitting in the warm sun on the steps. She often was talking while she swept, to the dogs, to the birds, to the squirrels, to herself, and to me. There was Hoppy the robin, who had had a damaged leg that she'd nursed back to health. There was a squirrel that would come and eat pecan bits from her hand, and the dogs were always milling around her legs. She'd go in to get them a treat like a hot dog that she pulled into bits. Here, here now, as she'd shove them a bit into separate spots to give them their share. She always was making wonderful sounds of some sort or the other, like the clicking bracelets, the tappy sandals, the sweet-talking the animals, the sweeping, those little noises she made when she tasted her tea, patting her chest with her kerchief, smiling how hot it was. Phew, she'd say. She was music. Her house smelled great, a mixture of dog, southern cooking like ham and red-eye gravy, barbecue, biscuits, and cakes. Cakes, cakes, cakes. My Aunt Billie's cakes were masterpieces. Her devotion to it was no less than the David being sculpted. It took hours. She made very thin layers, like 8, and told me it was her secret because they turned out with just the right texture that way, a little crisp on the outside. And also you could put more icing on with more layers. She made German chocolate, white cake with chocolate frosting, strawberry, and the best of all, red velvet. Watching her lovingly frost each layer, smoothing it on just so, was hypnotic. Everything she cooked, she did by hand and with love. Even something as simple as coleslaw became an event. She would shred the cabbage and carrots with a grater. She said doing it in a machine just didn't get it right. It didn't absorb the juice right that way. And she would mix and taste to get the dressing right. She was also happy while cooking, but deeply focused. She didn't just throw something together. Okay, back to the house. It was heaven for kids because you got to choose one of 2 magical places to sleep, both of which were away from the adults. It was like Aunt Billie knew people needed special places. One was a big screened porch. When you slept on the porch, you slept on a glider, the kind that when you sat on it, you could push it back and forth, kind of like a swing. The porch was completely surrounded by the pine trees, and you could hear the breeze in them all night. Pine trees create a very different song with the wind than other trees. When I was young, I was walking out at the lake where we lived and noticed one day there was a big grove of pines that stood apart from anything else. And when it was windy, the song would catch your attention as you walked. It didn't rustle like leaves. It was more watery or whooshy, a lovely peaceful sound. But on Aunt Billie's porch, in the morning if you drifted off, you'd get awakened by squirrels chattering and throwing nuts at the screen. There was a door off the screen porch to a brick tile patio Aunt Billie had built herself. And there was her elaborately laced wrought iron furniture that she completely painted anew some springs to make it clean and bright, and maybe some new colors she wanted. This was not a chore for her. She loved painting like she loved anything she did. So you could step out barefoot on the warm red tiles, and maybe Aunt Billie would be sitting there sipping tea and ask you what you'd like for breakfast. When she gave you a hug, "Come on over here and let me hug your neck." She smelled of pine and sweet tea and cake and lipstick and hand lotion and sometimes moonshine. She always kept her hands nice, even with all the work she did. Every afternoon she'd sit down and read the National Enquirer and rub lotion into her hands slowly and with pleasure. She was absorbed by the Enquirer. She earnestly told me once how she'd read that hummingbirds migrate by sitting on the backs of geese. I still have that image and a giggle in my head. So, what were her stories? I'm not sure it even mattered what she was saying. It was the tone and cadence of her voice, her soft southern accent, the way she'd drift off into a story and be living it. She told me what it was like to pick cotton in the hot sun, how sticky it was, hard to get off your fingers, and how she hated to pick tobacco because it had fireworms on the leaves sometimes. Then she'd show me the scar on her arm where she'd been burned by one. Afterwards, they jumped naked as jaybirds into the cold creek to swim. They liked harvesting sugar cane because they would peel it sometimes and suck on it like candy. And a mash resulted from the processing of it that they gave to the pigs who got drunk on it. Those pigs also got lots of watermelon because they grew so much, Aunt Billie said, they only ate the sweetest red heart center of it, then gave the rest to the pigs. She talked about wartime and how she worked in a factory rolling cigars, and she could roll 3 perfectly to anyone else's 1. She told me of the boy she met and married, how he was the most handsome thing she'd ever laid eyes on. She told me later how he hit her over and over. And she, unlike many women of her time, would not take it and left him. She told me how much later in life he had died in the hospital of brain cancer. And at the last, he asked for her. She was the person he wanted to be with, and she went and sat with him and held his hand whenever she could until he passed. It wasn't always big stories. Sometimes she'd just tell me things like the best barbecue you could ever find, Finch's just down the road, how long they smoked it in the ground to get the rich flavor, and how the sauce wasn't too sweet or thick, and the buns were nice and soft. Or she would sit and shell peas, and as they made their pleasant plopping noise into the metal bowl, she'd tell me how Crowder peas were the best. They had the most flavor. But she liked snap peas too, and I loved the crisp, sharp sound they made when she snapped them into lovely green bits. She came to live with us after her husband died, and not all that long after my father died, so it was just Aunt Billie and Mom. She loved men, even after her grieving for Uncle Bob. She loved to cook for them, dance with them, and though she never talked about it to me, I know she was a very sexual being. I know it because it bothered my mother, who thought she ought to cut that stuff out at her age. After my dad died, they'd both go out to one of the local taverns sometimes to get dinner. There was a place that made big tenderloin sandwiches they both liked, and they'd have some beers, and sometimes they'd dance. My mom, just because she liked to dance, but Aunt Billie because she liked to dance and liked being with a man. Sometimes Mom would come home and Aunt Billie did not, and that was when Mom would talk about needing to cut that stuff out. But she never did. She lived life in some smooth, natural flow, in touch with what was presented to her, in harmony with it. She didn't think much about things, not much philosophizing or opinions, except she didn't like church or preachers. She thought they were all a bunch of fakes. She didn't want a preacher at her funeral, but my family insisted, and he stood up there and said towards the end that Aunt Billie would stand by the kitchen door and peek in and listen when he came to visit my mom. And he believed she received God. And I couldn't exactly say bullshit, so I got up and talked for her, and I said she didn't think much of religion, but that she was as in harmony with whatever is God as anyone I've ever known. I said I hoped they had a big kitchen in heaven, and she had lots of men and dogs to enjoy her cooking. And my mom, who had pretty severe Alzheimer's at that time, said loudly, "Why are all of you saying all these nice things about her and not me?" Well, a little touch of Southern always adds color. Later in life, I volunteered for hospice to do life stories for those who were dying. I recorded their stories and regretted I had never recorded my aunt's beautiful voice. Yet it lives in my head, and hopefully in this story. I can hear her bracelets clicking and her sandals tapping and the sipping of tea or bourbon. Sweet-talking the dogs. I can see the red lips and gleam in her sea-colored eyes. And I feel the richness that she was and how it is now a part of me. I don't make coleslaw, but I make my own bagels, and I dance to my playlist while I do. And those bagels are part of my coffee rituals on Fridays and Sundays. I savor every bit of the process, from inhaling the punch of fragrance of the beans before grinding them, to pausing for a moan and little wiggle of pleasure at the first sip. I paint my toenails everything from Tropicala Fijiistic blue to Japanese rose garden pink. And I religiously feed the birds every day, always delighted when the sun catches their spread-wide feathers as they rise from the feeder, or never failing to be amazed that such a powerful song can come from the tiny body of a wren. What do you do that feels like slowing things down and savoring? Tell me. Or does life feel too fast? Did you have someone that told you stories? I think we discount joy a bit in our society. It's not up there with things like success or wealth or productiveness. But to me, having listened to so many hospice stories and coming close to death once myself, I'm a firm believer in the power of joy, in savoring the small things every moment you can manage to be aware. As Alice Walker wrote, I think it pisses God off when you walk by the color purple in a field somewhere and don't notice it. People think pleasing God is all God cares about, but any fool living in the world can see it always tried to please us back. Aunt Billie saw the color purple. Aunt Billie was the color purple.